You know, I usually stay out of these conversations, but with Caitlin Clark, I can't stay silent anymore.
But my first inclination is to say that this person is not a female. Firstly, because this was actually posted to Brittney's personal Instagram.
What happens when a generational talent arrives in a league that spent 3 decades begging for exactly that moment, and the league doesn't know how to handle it? That's the real story of Caitlin Clark and the WNBA. Not fabricated suspensions, not invented quotes from basketball legends, not unverified conspiracy theories. The actual documented reality of what's happening is compelling enough without any of that. Clark arrived and broke everything. Viewership records, attendance records, merchandise records, assist records. She became the fastest player in WNBA history to reach 600 assists. She averaged over 20 points per game in under 30 minutes of playing time, something no guard in league history had ever done. She generated 600% increases in merchandise sales and app engagement. She tripled the Fever's franchise value. And while all of that was happening, she was absorbing 17% of all flagrant fouls in the entire league, more than double the rate of any of her peers. Her parents stopped attending games because the environment became too toxic to watch in person. Congressional representatives sent letters to the league commissioner expressing concern about potential civil rights violations.
As far as I understand, it's mostly women without penises, but I leave that to you to figure it. Well, it's actually a little unclear because this Brittney Griner, a lot of people think she's a dude. But in any event, Brittney Griner is a black basketball player who some people think is a man.
The video shows a glimpse of what life was like for WNBA star Brittney Griner inside Russian prison. She spent her days carrying fabric because she was too tall to sit at the sewing tables where other prisoners worked. Her bed was too small for her 6'9" frame. Griner was arrested back in February for traveling with hashish oil, a substance banned in Russia. She was sentenced to 9 years in prison in August. Her release part of a prisoner swap for Victor Bout, a convicted Russian arms dealer.
ESPN's graphics department posted 4 different statistical categories in 4 weeks to minimize her record-breaking achievements. This is the story of a league handed its greatest opportunity and struggling to embrace it. To understand what's happening with Caitlin Clark and the WNBA, you have to understand the baseline that existed before she arrived. The league had been financially dependent on NBA subsidies for nearly 30 years. It had never turned a profit. It had never achieved sustainable mainstream television ratings. It had never generated the kind of commercial interest that would make it independently viable as a professional sports enterprise. Then Clark arrived, and almost everything changed overnight. Families planned vacations around her road games. Arenas that had never sold out were at capacity. National media outlets that had never covered regular season WNBA games were sending reporters. Sponsors who had shown no previous interest in women's basketball were suddenly paying attention. This was the moment the league had been waiting for. This was the economic breakthrough that could finally transform the WNBA from a subsidized passion project into a self-sustaining business. This was the opportunity that decades of patient investment had been building toward. What followed revealed something fundamental about the institution. The league's response to unprecedented growth was marked by evasion, control, and dysfunction at every level. This script documents that response using verified facts, confirmed reporting, and observable patterns. Because the real story is compelling enough, it doesn't need embellishment to matter. Start with the numbers, because numbers don't lie, and these numbers are alarming. In her rookie season, Caitlin Clark absorbed 17% of all flagrant fouls called in the entire WNBA. 17%. In a league of over 140 players, one player was on the receiving end of nearly 1 in 5 of the hardest fouls called by referees. To put that in perspective, if flagrant fouls were distributed evenly across the league, every player would receive roughly 0.7% of them. Clark was receiving 17%. That's approximately 24 times the average rate. And it's more than double the rate of any other player in the league, including the next highest recipient. That statistical anomaly doesn't happen by accident. That level of disparity requires explanation. And the explanations that have been offered by various commentators range from legitimate basketball analysis to irresponsible speculation. But the underlying statistical reality is not in dispute. Clark was fouled at unprecedented rates. That's verified by the actual game data. What makes it more significant is that the 17% figure only counts fouls that referees actually called. Rebecca Lobo, a former WNBA player and current ESPN analyst, has publicly noted that many fouls committed against Clark weren't being called. So the documented 17% likely understates the actual disparity in physical contact Clark was absorbing relative to her peers. Sean Milan, a Washington, D.C.-based consultant who analyzed this data, testified to the statistical significance. He noted that in her rookie season, Clark absorbed flagrant fouls at more than double the rate of any of her peers. He described it as creating a textbook hostile work environment and noted that under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the federal government has the authority to engage if the targeting is based on a protected class. That federal element is significant because it elevates the conversation beyond just basketball. When a consultant with government engagement expertise is pointing to Title VII implications, when members of Congress are writing letters to the league commissioner, when the statistical pattern is severe enough to generate legislative scrutiny, something serious is happening. The league's response to the statistical reality was reactive rather than proactive. They investigated and acted on specific incidents when those incidents became undeniable. Verified suspensions were issued for verified incidents. That process worked in specific cases. But the league didn't take structural action to address the pattern that was producing those incidents. A proactive institutional response would have recognized the statistical anomaly early in the season and taken action. Additional referee training, clear communication to teams about conduct standards, public statements from the commissioner's office making clear that the pattern was being monitored. None of that happened in any documented or verifiable way. Instead, the league was reactive. They acted when they had to. They didn't act when they could have prevented incidents by addressing the pattern early. That reactive approach is a documented institutional failure regardless of which specific incident you're examining. The congressional response validated the severity of the concern in ways that individual fans and analysts couldn't. When elected representatives write to a sports commissioner about potential civil rights violations involving one of the league's players, that's not normal. That's an extraordinary level of external scrutiny that reflects how serious the documented pattern had become. Congressman Jeff Duncan specifically referenced compiled video evidence showing physical contact that he described as unacceptable. He said a fifth grader could watch the footage and identify the behavior as inappropriate. He framed it as a workplace safety issue and a Title IX concern. That's the kind of language that creates real institutional pressure. The WNBA's response to the congressional letter was to issue statements. The Indiana Fever released a statement responding to a letter that didn't even name them, which itself was revealing about the organization's sense of implication in the situation. The league office offered general language about player safety, but neither response addressed the specific statistical pattern that had generated congressional concern. That gap between the severity of documented concern and the adequacy of institutional response is the core failure. The numbers were alarming. The external scrutiny was unprecedented. And the institutional response was carefully managed language designed to satisfy the immediate news cycle rather than substantive structural action designed to address the actual problem. The Indiana Fever organization's dysfunction throughout this season has been documented through multiple verified incidents that collectively paint a picture of institutional failure at every level of the organization. Start with the Justina Pariseau decision because it's the clearest example of organizational malpractice with documented consequences. The Las Vegas Aces submitted an offer sheet for Pariseau on January 14, 2025. The Fever had 24 hours to match it by promoting her from the developmental roster to a standard contract. They declined. Pariseau went from a $700 per week developmental contract to $150,000 for the rest of the season with Las Vegas. Pariseau is 6'4" with a 7-foot wingspan and shoots 43% from three. She's exactly the profile of player that the Fever desperately need, a shooter with size who can space the floor for Clark and open up driving lanes. The Fever chose instead to keep Damiris Dantas, a 32-year-old who averaged 3 points and 1 rebound in the playoffs. The consequences of that decision showed up in the box score when the Fever lost to the Minnesota Lynx 108-100. Minnesota exploited Indiana's size disadvantage all night. The bench depth problems that analysts predicted before the season started materialized exactly as predicted. And the player who would have directly addressed those problems was on the Las Vegas Aces, contributing to a championship program. The draft decision compounded the organizational dysfunction. The Fever took Raven Johnson when multiple analysts argued they desperately needed front court help. The same size and depth problems that the Lynx exploited in that loss were problems that a different draft choice could have addressed. The organization's decision-making pattern revealed an institution that doesn't fully understand what its franchise cornerstone actually needs to succeed. Amber Cox, the general manager, engaged defensively on social media when fans called out organizational decisions rather than addressing legitimate criticism through substantive responses. She responded to fan accounts questioning her enthusiasm levels at wins where Clark was featured prominently versus wins where she wasn't. That asymmetry in enthusiasm, while impossible to confirm definitively, was visible enough to multiple observers that it generated widespread comment. Stephanie White's press conference patterns revealed a coaching staff that was evasive on critical questions. When asked about the Congressional letter concerning Clark's treatment, White deflected to a team statement rather than providing passionate advocacy for her star player. When she had previously defended Aaliyah Thomas in passionate and detailed terms, the contrast with her measured deflection on Clark's situation was stark and documented. The load management decisions created additional controversy. The Fever confirmed at shoot-around that Clark and another player would alternate on back-to-back games, with White using the phrase flip-flop to describe the arrangement. This was being implemented at the same time the organization was claiming player safety as a priority. But the player safety framing didn't extend to publicly advocating for Clark against the documented physical targeting she was experiencing from opposing teams. Perhaps the most revealing organizational failure was the editing of press conference footage. Fans and journalists compared the Fever's official posted versions of Clark's press conferences with original broadcast footage and identified sections that had been removed. The removed sections included Clark's most critical comments about refereeing standards and player protection. The organization was literally editing out their star player's most honest statements about her experience. That's not a small thing. That's an organization actively managing the narrative about their own franchise player's experience in ways that minimize the severity of her documented concerns. It's institutional image management prioritized over player advocacy. It's the organization protecting itself from the implications of its star player's honest assessment, rather than addressing the substance of that assessment. The cumulative picture these documented incidents paint is of an organization that benefits enormously from Clark's presence: tripled franchise value, sold-out road games, national television attention, while failing to provide the advocacy, roster construction, and organizational support that a franchise player deserves and requires. Clark's parents stopped attending games. That visible withdrawal of family support from a player's professional games is not a normal occurrence. It's a signal that the environment has become genuinely intolerable for the people closest to the situation. And the organization's failure to create an environment where the parents of their franchise player can comfortably attend games is perhaps the most human and damning indictment of all. The ESPN Insight statistical manipulation is among the most clearly documented institutional failures in this entire story, because it left a paper trail. 4 graphics in less than 4 weeks. 4 different statistical categories, each one designed to produce a specific narrative outcome. each one moving goalposts in ways that systematically minimized Clark's verified achievements while elevating another player's profile. The sequence is documented. On June 29th, ESPN Insights posted a graphic declaring Olivia Miles the fastest player to reach 350 points plus 100 assists. Rebounds were excluded from this category. At the same game count, Clark had 104 rebounds and Miles had 91. Clark cleared the rebound threshold, Miles didn't. So ESPN Insights built a category that excluded rebounds entirely. 2 weeks later, on July 13th, ESPN Insights posted a new graphic. This time the threshold was 400 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists. Rebounds were back. Why? Because by July 13th, Miles had crossed 100 rebounds. The obstacle was gone, so the obstacle was reintroduced. When rebounds hurt the preferred narrative, they were excluded. When Miles cleared them, they were brought back. On July 22nd, a third graphic appeared. The threshold was now 500 points and 150 assists. Rebounds were gone again. At this point, Clark had 150 rebounds. Miles had fewer than 110. The gap was significant. ESPN's response was to delete rebounds from the equation a second time. The pattern is undeniable. Every time a variable showed Clark ahead, it was either excluded or the threshold was moved higher. Every time a variable became favorable to Miles, it was reintroduced. The categories weren't tracking records. They were being built to produce specific outcomes. Holly Rowe, an ESPN on-air broadcaster, inadvertently confirmed the manipulation when she stated on an ESPN broadcast that Miles had achieved 300 points, 100 rebounds, and 100 assists, framing it as a record for any player, not just rookies. That record already belonged to Clark. ESPN's own broadcaster confirmed Clark's record while trying to celebrate Miles's achievement. The silence is equally damning. When Clark hit the milestones at 19, 21, 24, and 25 games that would have generated extensive coverage if they belonged to any other player, ESPN Insights posted nothing. Same data. Same game logs. Same statistical achievements. And the platform that was posting 4 graphics in 4 weeks for another player said nothing. That contrast is the whole story. 4 graphics in 4 weeks for one player, 0 graphics for Clark's equivalent achievements. That's not statistical analysis. That's narrative construction using the apparatus of statistical presentation. The practical consequence matters as much as the institutional failure. Casual fans don't track box scores. They see a graphic on social media with ESPN's institutional authority behind it, and they accept it as fact. They have no reason not to. ESPN has reach and credibility. When ESPN posts something, most people have no reason to fact-check it. That trust is exactly what was being exploited. A platform with ESPN's reach was using its institutional authority to rewrite the historical record of Clark's achievements in real time. The people who caught it were fans tracking game logs, comparing graphics side by side, doing the statistical homework that journalists should have been doing. The sloppiness of the execution is what exposed it. If ESPN Insights had picked one threshold and stuck with it, the manipulation might not have been noticed. But changing the category 4 times in 4 weeks left an obvious paper trail. The receipts are the 4 graphics posted on documented dates with documented category changes that track perfectly with which variables showed Clark ahead at each game count checkpoint. Clark's records are real. Her marks at 19, 21, 24, and 25 games are documented and verified in actual game logs that don't change. No amount of threshold shuffling changes what she actually did on the court. But the manipulation affected public perception among the casual fans who make up the majority of the audience that ESPN reaches. And affecting public perception is the point of the exercise. The Sophie Cunningham Seattle incident is one of the most clearly documented stories of the season because multiple verified elements confirm what happened. A co-owner of the Seattle Storm was fined and suspended from 5 home games by the WNBA. That institutional consequence confirms the severity of what occurred. Here's what's verified. Two fans attended the Fever vs. Storm game at Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. They were holding a sign expressing gratitude to Sophie Cunningham for publicly advocating for women's sports. The sign didn't name any opposing player. It didn't use inflammatory language. It simply said thank you to a player they admired. Celeste Caton, a minority co-owner of the Seattle Storm, approached those fans mid-game. According to the fans' account, which was given in a documented interview shortly after the incident, Caton called them completely insane, used profanity at them, and had security called. One of the fans, described as a teenage girl, was left in tears. Multiple witnesses confirmed the basic sequence. The WNBA investigated and confirmed enough of it to impose meaningful consequences. Caton was fined and suspended from 5 home games. Storm majority owner Jenny Gilder released a statement saying, "Every fan deserves to feel welcome, regardless of what they believe," and acknowledging that a co-owner had made remarks to fans. That institutional acknowledgement is significant. Organizations don't apologize and accept league discipline for things that didn't happen. The apology and the suspension confirm that something occurred that crossed a line the WNBA recognized as unacceptable. The context of what preceded the incident matters. Cunningham had given an ESPN interview weeks earlier in which she stated her belief that women's sports should be protected and that girls shouldn't have to compete against biological males. She said it clearly, without attacking any individual, and maintained the position when reporters returned, hoping she'd walk it back. That consistency under pressure is notable. Most athletes in her position would have softened their original statement with enough qualifications to drain it of meaning. Cunningham didn't. She said it again, nearly word for word. She added that she extends love to everyone and believes there's space for everyone, but won't change genuine beliefs because people want her to. That authenticity generated a national response that nobody in the WNBA was fully prepared for. The White House press secretary commented publicly. USA Today covered it. ESPN ran segments. Fox News gave it national attention. A role player in the WNBA became a national figure in a cultural conversation extending far beyond basketball. The fans who showed up in Seattle to express support for Cunningham were engaging with the WNBA product in exactly the way sports leagues want fans to engage. They bought tickets. They attended a game. They brought a sign supporting a player they admired. From a pure business perspective, that's organic fan engagement that organizations spend resources trying to generate. What happened to them instead was that they were confronted by ownership, called insane, subjected to profanity, had security called. One was left in tears, and that experience was documented in a post-incident interview given immediately afterward while memories were fresh. The asymmetry within that same arena is documented and visible. Players wearing shirts expressing political views on the other side of this cultural conversation were celebrated by the crowd. A sign thanking Cunningham generated a confrontation with ownership. That asymmetry tells you something about how the institution applies its stated values about inclusion in practice versus in principle. The WNBA's discipline of Caton is the right response to a documented incident. But discipline after the fact doesn't change the institutional culture that made the behavior feel acceptable in the first place. A co-owner doesn't approach paying customers at a public event and call them insane unless there's something in the institutional environment that makes that feel like an appropriate response. Addressing that institutional culture requires more than fining one individual. It requires consistent demonstration that the welcome principle applies equally to everyone, regardless of which side of a contested cultural question their sign represents. That consistent demonstration hasn't been documented in any sustained way throughout this season. The clearest documented failure in the WNBA's response to its biggest growth opportunity is the absence of strong leadership from Commissioner Cathy Engelbert during the moments when leadership mattered most. Leadership in professional sports is most visible and most necessary during crises. When controversial situations arise, when institutional tensions become public, when the league faces scrutiny from external forces like Congress or mainstream media, the The commissioner's role is to provide direction, to articulate a clear vision, to make the institution's values and priorities clear through concrete actions rather than carefully managed statements. The documented evidence of Engelbert's response to the Clark situation throughout this season is a pattern of absence. When Clark was being fouled at unprecedented statistical rates, Engelbert didn't make strong public statements or announce structural changes to referee training and conduct standards. She managed the issue through institutional silence and occasional vague references to player safety. When the Congressional letter arrived asking questions about potential civil rights violations involving Clark's treatment, Engelbert didn't hold a press conference addressing the specific concerns raised. She didn't announce specific policy changes in response to documented statistical disparities. The league office issued statements, but statements that manage controversy are different from leadership that addresses it. When the Sophie Cunningham Seattle incident exposed how the league's stated values about inclusion were being applied asymmetrically, Engelbert acted on the specific incident, the Catan suspension, but didn't address the broader institutional culture that produced the incident. When coaches were giving evasive answers to basic questions, Stephanie White claiming she wasn't scientifically educated enough to answer questions about women's sports, Alex Samara completely dodging direct questions about league participation standards, Engelbert didn't provide the institutional clarity that would have given coaches direction about how to handle these conversations. Dan Dockish, a sports media commentator, called publicly for Engelbert to resign. His characterization that the league had turned into a PR nightmare under her leadership, that every week brought new controversy, that the league was failing to capitalize on unprecedented opportunity, reflects a broader documented perception of leadership failure. The comparison to David Stern is instructive. Stern ran the NBA through multiple crises across decades of leadership. He made himself visible during difficult moments. He made decisions that were sometimes controversial but always decisive. He articulated a clear vision for where the league was going and backed that vision with concrete actions. He didn't disappear during crises and emerge with carefully worded statements afterward. The WNBA has never had that kind of commissioner. It's operated more as a developmental enterprise where leadership is cautious, consensus-driven, and conflict-averse. That approach may have been appropriate when the league was struggling for survival. It's not appropriate when the league is in the middle of the most significant growth opportunity in its history. The specific failure isn't that Engelbert made any particular wrong decision. It's that she was largely absent from the moments where the right decision needed to be made and defended publicly. The league needed someone to say, "The statistical pattern of physical targeting we're seeing is unacceptable, and here are the specific structural changes we're making to address it." The league needed someone to say, "Every fan at every WNBA game deserves to feel welcome regardless of their viewpoint, and here's how we're going to enforce that consistently." The league needed someone to articulate a clear vision for how the WNBA was going to manage its unprecedented growth. None of that happened in any documented way. Instead, there were statements and careful management and institutional silence on the questions that most needed clear answers. That's documented leadership absence during a critical institutional moment. The consequence of that absence is that individual coaches and organizational officials were left to navigate impossible situations without clear institutional direction. Stephanie White had to answer questions about trans athletes in women's sports without any league-level guidance about how to handle those questions. Amber Cox had to manage the Pariseau situation without clear organizational philosophy about how to build around Clark. Individual organizations had to respond to congressional scrutiny without coordinated league-level communication strategy. Leadership absence creates institutional chaos. It creates environments where different officials make different decisions based on different individual judgments without coherent institutional direction. That's exactly what the WNBA experienced throughout this season. And the documented result is a league that fumbled its greatest opportunity through a combination of institutional dysfunction and leadership vacuum. After documenting the dysfunction, the statistical failures, the organizational malpractice, and the leadership absence, the question that matters is what needs to change for the WNBA to actually capitalize on the unprecedented opportunity it's been given. The changes required operate at multiple levels simultaneously. None of them are simple. None of them can be implemented with a press release or a carefully worded statement. All of them require genuine institutional commitment over sustained periods of time. At the league level, the commissioner's office needs to take proactive structural action on documented patterns rather than reactive incident management. The statistical anomaly of Clark absorbing 17% of flagrant fouls is not a problem that gets solved by investigating and suspending players after specific incidents occur. It requires structural changes to how referees are trained, how conduct standards are communicated to teams, and how the league monitors and responds to patterns of disproportionate physical targeting. The referee situation specifically requires investment. Coaches and analysts have noted repeatedly that referee training and compensation are inadequate. Caitlin Clark herself has publicly called for treating referees as full-time employees with better compensation and more systematic training. That specific recommendation, coming from the league's biggest star, deserves institutional action rather than acknowledgement and inaction. At the organizational level, the Indiana Fever need to demonstrate through actions rather than statements that they're committed to building a championship-caliber roster around Clark. The Pariseau decision represents exactly the kind of organizational failure that needs to not happen again. The draft decision needs to be evaluated honestly against the team's actual needs. The pattern of evasion in press conferences needs to be replaced with transparent communication that builds rather than erodes trust. The social media behavior of organizational officials needs to match the stated commitment to Clark. When the general manager's social media patterns create the impression of differential enthusiasm based on whether Clark is prominently featured in wins, that creates a credibility problem that can only be solved through consistent demonstrated enthusiasm for their franchise players' success. The coaching staff needs institutional support to answer difficult questions directly. Stephanie White being coached into evasion on basic questions about her sport serves nobody. It makes the organization look incompetent. It makes the coaching staff look dishonest. And it creates a media environment where every press conference becomes a minefield because nobody trusts the answers they're getting. At the media level, ESPN and other major platforms need to apply consistent statistical standards rather than building categories designed to produce preferred narrative outcomes. The documented evidence of the four-graphic manipulation represents an institutional credibility failure that should generate internal accountability. What specific individuals made the decisions about which categories to use? What review processes exist for statistical claims about specific players? Those questions deserve institutional answers. The fan treatment issue revealed by the Seattle incident needs genuine institutional response beyond disciplining one individual. The WNBA needs to demonstrate through consistent behavior at multiple venues over sustained time that every fan is actually welcome regardless of their viewpoint. That demonstration has to happen through documented actions, not just through statements about stated values. The broader cultural tension around the league's growth, the ideological diversity of the new fan base versus the traditional cultural positioning of the league, needs honest institutional engagement rather than evasion. The WNBA can't build sustainable mainstream success while treating significant portions of its potential audience as ideologically unwelcome. That's not commercially viable, and it contradicts the stated commitment to inclusion. The league's financial model also needs honest examination. Decades of NBA subsidization have created institutional habits that may not serve the league well as it pursues genuine financial independence. The willingness to make commercially rational decisions, protecting the league's biggest economic asset, welcoming new audiences, engaging with mainstream media, needs to override the institutional comfort with managing rather than growing. If the WNBA makes these changes, substantive, structural, demonstrated through consistent action over time, the opportunity that Caitlin Clark has created remains capturable. The audiences are there, the commercial interest is there, the mainstream attention is there. All that's required is institutional willingness to prioritize that opportunity over the comfort of familiar patterns. The league still has time, not unlimited time, but the window hasn't closed yet. Clark is still playing. The attention is still focused. The opportunity is still real. What the league does with that opportunity over the next 12 to 24 months will define the WNBA's trajectory for the next decade. The Caitlin Clark story is the most important story in women's sports right now. Not because of fabricated suspensions or invented quotes from basketball legends or unverified conspiracy theories, because of what's actually documented and verified and observable to anyone paying attention. A generational talent arrived and transformed a league overnight. She broke records that took other players decades to build. She generated economic value that the league had been chasing for 30 years. She brought millions of new viewers to women's basketball for the first time. She gave the WNBA everything it needed for sustainable success. And the league's response has been marked by organizational dysfunction, evasive leadership, statistical manipulation by major media platforms, and institutional failures at every level. That's the real story. That's the compelling documented reality that doesn't need embellishment or fabrication to be significant. A league at the most important crossroads in its history. A generational talent whose prime years are finite. An institution choosing between growth and control, between embracing an opportunity and managing it to death. The statistical anomalies are real. The organizational failures are documented. The leadership absence is observable. The media manipulation left receipts. Caitlin Clark is doing her job at an historic level. The question the entire basketball world is watching is whether the institution around her will finally do its job too.